Welcome to the I-24 News National Security Podcast in partnership with INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. I'm your host, Nicole Zedeck. Each week, we bring you in-depth discussions with expert analysts on some of the most pressing national security challenges facing Israel today. So, let's get started. U.S. President Donald Trump is back in the White House, and that could mean some big changes for the Middle East. Trump's regional policy during his first term was nothing short of transformative, shaking up alliances, reshaping regional dynamics, and really redefining America's role in the region. Now, as he enters a second term, the stakes are higher, the challenges greater, and the opportunities for change are major. So what can the region and Israel expect from another 4 years of Donald Trump? In today's episode, we'll talk about just that. The key pillars of Trump's Middle East policy, from the Abraham Accords to the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, and what it all means for Israel's interests. Well, to discuss what's next for the Middle East under Trump's leadership, I'm joined by Dr. Chuck Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel, Senior Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, as well as an author of a number of books about Israeli national security studies. Dr. Chuck Freilich, thank you for being with us on the podcast today.
My pleasure, and let's make it Chuck.
Okay, great, Chuck. Now, it's been nearly 2 weeks that Trump has been in office at this point, and we're seeing just the initial ramifications already of his time in office, but we can even look about before he was in office, signing this ceasefire deal inside Gaza, this hostage release deal as well. And so by making this a move before he even came into the White House for a second term, does this really show his priorities in the region right now?
Well, I think what he wanted to do is to begin clearing the table of issues that are for him distractions. He didn't want to have to deal with the hostage issue for strategic reasons and domestic political reasons. He wanted to get it behind us. And he famously threatened the sides with hell to be paid if they didn't reach a deal. I think to the surprise of many people in Israel, most of that hell was actually directed at Israel, at the prime minister. His ability to influence Hamas is quite limited. It was through the Egyptians, through the Qatari mediators, and most of it was directed at us. But he achieved that. He now sent the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, to, I would say, hold the sides' hands or to babysit to make sure that this goes through. And I don't think it's by coincidence that the Prime Minister was invited to Washington next week.
The first foreign leader that will be sitting down with Trump.
And the day or the day before, the negotiations on stage 2 are supposed to begin. And I think there's going to be a very, very clear message delivered. You complete stage 2 as planned, or they may really be held to pay.
So this is kind of the double-edged sword that it seems Israel might be facing with Trump round 2, because on the one hand, we are seeing one of the strongest pro-Israel administrations, but with that support comes the different concessions that Israel might have to pay as well.
Absolutely. In the first administration, he did some really good things for Israel, historic moves, whether it was finally moving the embassy to Jerusalem, something which had been on the congressional books since 1995. It took 30 years almost, and he finally did it. Recognizing the Golan as part of Israel. Everybody in the world knows that the Golan is going to remain part of Israel. It was time to do that. He put forward let's say, a controversial proposal for a two-state solution.
The deal of the century.
The deal of the century. Mr. Trump is nothing if not fond of somewhat bombastic terms. But it was a proposal for 70-30. The Palestinians would get 70% of the West Bank. Israel would get 30%. Totally unacceptable to both sides. But he was breaking with pre-existing diplomatic axioms, long accepted diplomatic axioms. Now he's coming, he also, by the way, did something very, very bad from our point of view, an historic blunder, which was the withdrawal from the nuclear deal. Iran was far from a nuclear capability at the time. It is now a threshold nuclear state.
And Israel views that as bad, this maximum pressure campaign that Trump is putting on Iran, or put on Iran.
No, I think the maximum pressure campaign is a good thing. One of the reasons it failed was because it was actually only in place for 2 years. And then Biden came in. It took Trump a couple of years to actually get it in place. If it's back in place now, and it will be shortly, and if it's there for a few years, it could have a real effect. And I think what Trump is trying to do is to reach a new deal. It's not the same deal. It can't be. That's passé. But a new deal from a position of strength. And he's wielding this big club, whether it's the sanctions, which really did hit the Iranian economy. He at least has an implicit military club there behind him. And he wants to reach the New Deal. The question is what happens if that doesn't happen within a reasonable period of time, a few months, 6 months, a year. At some point, then there will have to be other decisions taken, or it just becomes negotiations for the sake of negotiations.
And so if that happens, then what is the best outcome for Israel? Because if this maximum pressure campaign does continue, and it seems like Trump is focusing more on the diplomatic route, by still wielding this massive stick, right, stating that the military option is still always there. But let's say the diplomatic means do go through when it comes to Iran's nuclear capabilities. Is that enough to really diminish the threat of nuclear weapons, or is that then going to put Israel and the United States and these Western countries at risk as well?
Unfortunately, national security decision-making is almost always about a choice between bad options. Of the bad options, I think the diplomatic one it's the best of the bad. Look, a military strike, even if it's an American attack, even if it's completely successful, will give us maybe a 3 to 4 year breathing space, and that might be optimistic. And if Israel does it, it'll give us a year or two. A deal, a diplomatic deal, well, the old one was supposed to be, the minimum part was 10 years, a part of it was 15, and part was in perpetuity. There are a number of options for how to address the nuclear issue. It can be subversion, it can be attempts at regime change. The only one that provides for a long-term postponement, maybe even a solution, is a diplomatic deal. So that's the number one preference, I think, for Israel. Secondly would be an American military strike. Thirdly, a joint one, and I hope we don't reach the stage where we have to go it alone, because it'll be difficult.
And hopefully it doesn't reach that point, but right now it does seem like the Trump administration is backing Israel, but wants to take matters into its own hands first. Now, Chuck, you also mentioned, at least during Trump's first term in office, his view on trying to subdue the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this two-state solution, the deal of the century. And are we expected to see that come into action and come into negotiations again during this time in the White House, or is Trump looking at bigger fish to fry, as in normalization with Saudi Arabia?
Well, I don't know if that's bigger fish. An Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement would be a very large one. But I do think that it is part of this bigger, maybe even grand strategy that you're suggesting. In other words, first of all, he needs the hostage deal to go through so that there's a real ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon, and then he can try and put the trilateral deal with the Saudis together, trilateral, the Saudis, U.S., Israel. The first part is that the Saudis have to agree to normalize with Israel, and in exchange, Israel has to agree to, until now, the Saudis have insisted on a Palestinian state. Maybe they'll be willing to go back to some sort of vaguer language. And once that happens, and those are two very big ifs, then the U.S. is supposed to compensate the Saudis with two really critical moves. One is a defense treaty. The U.S. hasn't given a defense treaty to any country in the world since 1961. And by the way, if they give it to the Saudis, it would be a chutzpah if they didn't give it to us. And they're supposed to recognize a Saudi civil nuclear program. I think effective safeguards can probably put in place, but civil nuclear programs have this really nasty tendency to morph into military nuclear programs.
Let's talk about that defense treaty, because this memorandum of understanding, it seems like it is in the steps for Israel to try and start negotiating for some sort of a security alliance with the United States, likely within the next year, the next 2 years. There is kind of this critical window when it comes to Israel in building this defense treaty, because they want it likely before the midterm elections so that they can kind of monopolize on the support that they have from all of the different Republican parties.
Well, this is a unique opportunity because of the possibility for this big deal and for the Saudis getting a defense treaty. Now, the truth is a number of American presidents in the past have considered the possibility. Carter was willing to consider it, or willing to do it as part of the Camp David negotiations if necessary. Clinton was willing to do it as to clinch the deals with the Palestinians and with the Syrians back in 1999, 2000. So the idea has been with us for a long time. I think, first of all, the U.S.-Israeli relationship has grown so much closer, the strategic relationship, in recent decades, and that already partly makes it a more realistic idea. But still, there will be very, very broad opposition to this in the United States. Again, it's not necessarily Israel. The U.S. hasn't given a defense treaty to anyone since 1961, and that was in the context of the heyday of the Cold War. All right. Now, if they do it to the Saudis, then we have a case to come along and say we want it also. A lot of people in Israel have always opposed this and oppose it today. People are concerned about maintaining Israel's freedom of action. In INSS, I think we're the first really serious body in Israel to come out with a formal proposal to do everything we can to try and reach a defense treaty with the U.S., saying what it should include and saying how we would address the potential problems involved, and there are problems.
Well, it seems like under Trump's new administration, there is a real reality and hope for positive change in the region, but all of that kind of revolves around this ceasefire maintaining, at least for now, inside Gaza.
Absolutely.
Now, in order for that to happen, one of the ideas that Trump has recently touted is the relocation of these Gazan civilians. When we talk about rebuilding the day after in Gaza, Trump now stating, let's move the Gazans out, let's move them to Egypt, and let's move them to Jordan. This is a controversial opinion coming from Trump.
Well, it's extraordinarily controversial. I think people who know Jordan and Egypt and the Palestinians would say that it's totally off the wall. One of the fundamental tenets of Palestinian nationalism is the concept of staying where we are in the refugee camps, if necessary, until the day that we can return to our homeland. Now, Trump has an advantage and a disadvantage when it comes to all of this. The disadvantage is that he really doesn't know a great deal about these issues and doesn't particularly care to know a lot about them. The advantage is that he's willing to countenance things that other people knew were impossible, can't be done, and this probably can't be done either. But he's thinking out of the box, new ways to address resolution to the conflict in the way that his proposal on the deal of the century was 70-30. That was totally unacceptable. Everybody knew it was unacceptable. But it was realigning the pieces in a potential.
Because it's been so stale in this arena for so many years, and so by having this, sometimes he's called a bombastic man with controversial opinions, but at least there are these differing opinions to maybe get some movement when it comes to the grand scheme of things.
Absolutely. And look, I believe, and I say this as someone who is a lifelong supporter of the two-state solution, I don't believe it's possible anymore. Okay. If I think it was dead before the war, I think it's certainly dead now. I also believe that separating from the Palestinians and hopefully reaching peace with them, but certainly separating from them, is Israel's #1 national security interest other than just survival. And I think we have to look at new ways of going forward, and sometimes it's reviving old ideas. The one that I personally think is probably the way to go is a Jordanian-Palestinian confederation in which the Palestinian component would be on 90+% of the West Bank. We would annex the remaining few percent. If you propose this today, the Jordanians will say over our dead bodies. The Palestinians will have qualms but might be able to accept this. I think we have to find ways, and I have a number of ideas, how to structure this in a way that Jordan will not only view it as not being a threat to their interests, but maybe even an advantage for them. And Trump might be the guy who's willing to pick up this kind of a ball.
With some of these ideas that Trump is touting, is there also the possibility of this to backlash then when we're looking at these different ideas of regional peace, but by almost putting the Palestinian issue to the sidelines, does that create then more tension and uprising within the Palestinian society?
Well, I don't know that he's going to put the Palestinian issue aside again, as he did in the first term. I think one of his biggest objectives in this second term is to get a Nobel Prize. The man has great wealth. He has had an active, let's say, career with women. Okay, he's been president of the United States. He's had power. The one thing he hasn't gotten yet is a Nobel Prize. To do that, he needs an Israeli-Palestinian Accord. So it might be actually a central piece of his administration.
A more bigger push for possibly this to make sure that it lasts. And as you also mentioned already, we've seen this push here in Israel, Steve Woodcock in the region, to make sure that this ceasefire deal does go through. But once again, we're talking about the benefits that Israel has with this partnership, but the consequences as well, perhaps, really walking and making sure that Israel then does abide by this ceasefire, which we've already seen some internal politics arising from that. Not all of the government ministers are on board with this phase 2 of the ceasefire going through. But if Trump wants that to happen, are Bibi's hands tied? Does it need to happen?
Well, not all of the government ministers were on board for the first stage either. And I won't say what I think of them because it's not fit for broadcasting. But look, Israel is a country which is extraordinarily dependent on the United States. And it's very hard for us to say no to an American president when he's really determined. We've actually done it on a surprising number of occasions over history. I don't think there are many dependent states, in effect, client states, that have had the freedom of maneuver that Israel's had over the decades. But yeah, there are times when we have to make decisions that accord with American preferences. There's a price to be paid for this really remarkable, unprecedented strategic relationship between a global superpower and a tiny regional player. Yeah, there are prices to be paid. The overall balance is so overwhelmingly favorable
that it's worth the price for Israel to pay. But then the United States, what are they getting out of this partnership?
And over the years, more and more Americans are asking themselves that painful question. Well, they're stabilizing, they're supporting what is the only democracy for many, many miles in every direction, hundreds or thousands of miles in every direction. They are supporting a country which over time has come to be recognized as a strategic partner. In the early decades, I would say until the 90s, really, the U.S. viewed its relationship with Israel as being just a normative one, fellow democracies, the Judeo-Christian heritage, the Holocaust remembrance, etc. In the last 30 or so years, the U.S. has begun to realize that actually Israel isn't just a strategic liability, but in some ways it's a strategic asset. I think we've been raising some questions about that in recent years, partly because we've said no on too many of the diplomatic issues, partly because we did not perform very well on October 7th, but since then I think have redeemed ourselves militarily. So the U.S. gets the normative thing, gets the strategic thing, and superpowers want allies all over the world. They never know when they're going to need them.
Certainly seems to be the case. Now, meanwhile, the United States still does, as a superpower, have this military presence in the region as well, but Trump is an American-first policy. We're talking about more of this military disengagement, perhaps, to come over his second term in the White House. What does that mean for troops in Syria, for troops in these other different Arab region as well? And how could it impact Israel to possibly fill this void that their military disengagement leaves behind?
Well, first, that's a very good question, and I don't know what they're going to do. If they withdraw the troops from Syria, we're talking only 2,000 guys there. That could have a serious impact on Syrian stability and on the flow again of arms from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is going to be hard to do because of the new regime there, but it'll make it easier. If they pull troops out of Iraq, it's an advisory force today that can undermine the stability of the Iraqi government. The U.S. still has a system of bases around the region, and it's got the Fifth Fleet. I forget the latest number, but it's a couple of tens of thousands of troops in the region in any event. Will he withdraw some of them or not? I don't know. There's no guarantee that the Fifth Fleet will remain there. It's been there for decades, so it's hard to imagine it's going anywhere. But there is a big question. In terms of the impact on Israel, the biggest question, of course, is what he's willing to do vis-a-vis Iran. even short of taking military action, the threat of military action, having a deterrent presence, doing what Biden did last year, for the first time in the history of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, joint fighting in it, okay? We never had joint combat operations before.
Wow.
So we'll see what happens.
So we'll have to see exactly if that military action does step up. Chuck, as we're talking about the relationship that we saw in the first term in the White House, now this relationship that we're expecting to see in Trump's second term in the White House, it's a big question, but do you expect it to be better or worse for Israel when it comes to Trump's second term?
Well, first of all, of course, that's a judgmental question, and it depends on one's political views, views about the peace process.
From a strategic and a security perspective.
Yeah, but okay, there's no security perspective that is totally devoid of one's political outlook. Okay. I think there is a potential for some really good things, okay? In the sense that he recognized Jerusalem, the Golan, in the first term. He can do things like that again now. I think what will surprise many people, and I think there's already been a rude awakening on the part of the Israeli right, is that there's also potential for friction in almost every area, whether it's on the Palestinian issue, whether it's on Iran, Hezbollah and stability in the north, the bilateral relationship. This year, this 2025 or next year, by the latest, we have to begin negotiations on the next 10-year aid package. The current package runs out in 2028. The IDF's entire force buildup plan for the next decade is dependent on two assumptions. One, that we're getting another package, and B, that it'll be bigger and better than the previous one. Which
could be complicated, already seeing Trump's vision and halt on some of this foreign aid.
Absolutely. Are they going to agree to this? And it's not necessarily anti-Israelism. It's the fact that the Republican Party is not thrilled with foreign aid, and particularly the right wing of the Republican Party. And they're going to be cutting the American budget drastically in order to meet the various things that Trump wants to do. One of the obvious places to cut is foreign aid. So we could have a problem over that. Will we get the kind of security assurances that we need down the line?
We have seen some of those security assurances already with Trump reversing Biden administration's decision to halt some of these large weapon shipments, these 2,000-pound bombs. Trump now says they are on their way because simply Israel already paid for them.
Well, okay, I think it's more than that we just paid for it. Maybe that was the pretext that was given. He probably, well, I'm going to rephrase that. As long as we play along from his point of view, he won't use weapon sales as a source of leverage. The truth is, Biden didn't do very much of it either. And in the history of the relationship, there's never been a president who has supported us like Biden did. Until the last few months, he started, under pressure from the Democratic Party, he imposed some very, very limited sanctions. Most of the aid continued going through. We'll see how Trump plays it. Again, I mean, this could be, he could really put the screws to Israel, because in the end, I think he has some sort of real spot in his heart for Israel, but Trump really has only one real spot in his heart, and that's for Trump.
All of this Trump and America First policy, it will be interesting to see exactly how it does impact the entire Middle East region. Chuck, we've been going into this big picture, but as we're wrapping up the last few minutes here, I'm going to ask you a quick rapid fire round, some quick questions, and just give me the first response that comes to your head.
First or maybe the second.
Exactly. So the main one being right now, what is Trump's main goal and priority when it comes to the Middle East?
To reach the Saudi deal, including an Israeli, at least a partial deal between Israel and the Palestinians.
Right now, which country in the region has the most to gain with Trump back in the White House?
Short term may be Israel, but I would need more term to give you a really considered answer for that.
On the flip side of that, then, which country has the most to lose?
Well, maybe the Palestinians or the Iranians.
Would Trump back an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities?
Oh, that's a big question. And I don't know. I'm afraid that he will say, guys, go and do what you want. You're on your own.
What do you think that is likely to be the biggest challenge for Trump when it comes to his goals for the region?
The Mideast is a really tough place. And the best of intentions and the best thought out plans, and I'm not sure that Mr. Trump is a president with the best thought out plans, but they've just shattered on the rocks of Middle Eastern shores. It's really hard to make major changes, positive ones, in this region.
So then, going off of that, are his policies going to just deepen these regional tensions?
Possibly.
Are you hopeful now that we have a second term?
I'm always hopeful. I was born an inveterate optimist, but when one lives in the Middle East and studies the Middle East, a very, very healthy dose of pessimism is a good thing.
One more question, Chuck, just being, when we talk about this America First approach, how sustainable is that when it comes to the Middle East?
Well, the question is whether how sustainable it is anywhere. Countries like to be considered partners, not to be considered dictatees, okay? Nobody likes to have things forced down their throat in personal life and certainly not in national life. Trump can force some things which may, in the end, be viewed as being very positive. He may also break a lot of things.
We'll certainly have to see what is to come, as these are just the first few weeks of his term in the White House. But as we've been discussing for the past half hour, there are a lot of ramifications that will not only be felt here in Israel, but certainly throughout the entire region. Dr. Chuck Freilich, thank you for joining us on this episode of the National Security Podcast.
My pleasure.
Now, that is all we have for you on this latest edition of the National Security Podcast. You can always catch up on our past episodes on Spotify. Just search National Security Podcast and you will see all of our past interviews with the best guests, giving you the expert analysis on what's happening right here in Israel. As always, I'm Nicole Zedeck, and thank you so much for listening.